All right, so then that will be available online probably in just a few days. Okay, so a lot of you are familiar with us, but I'll just really quick go through who we are and what we do, since this will be available online for anyone who misses it. So Wissahickon Trails is a nonprofit environmental group based in Ambler, and our focus is the 64 square mile Wissahickon Creek watershed, which is all the land over which water moves as it makes its way to the Wissahickon Creek. We were established in 1957, and since that time, we've successfully saved close to 1,300 acres of land from being developed within Montgomery County. All of that land lies on the ancestral territory of the Lenape people, and it makes up our 12 nature preserves, which have trails that are open to the public from dawn to dusk. We do our best to actively restore and manage our preserves in a way that ensures that the plants and animals have what they need to survive. And you'll see that a lot in this presentation that goes over a lot of our work at Crossways. And we focus a lot on improving habitat for birds, because doing so means we also improve habitat for insects and mammals and reptiles, amphibians, etc. So you'll see that in this presentation a lot as well. And we do all of this work because we believe that people benefit when nature thrives. And our mission is to inspire and engage as many people in the watershed as possible to protect, steward, and enjoy the land and waterways of the Wissahickon Valley. All of this is only possible because we have the support of really awesome community, like all of you, people that share our love of the natural world and want to be a part of helping to protect it. So thank you all for your support in us doing that. Okay, so tonight, we will be at Crossways Preserve, which is in Whitpain Township in Bluebell. The map here on the left shows all of our preserves in dark green. It's a little hard to see maybe, and you all probably are a little bit familiar with this, but all of our preserves kind of follow Margaret Rohde because they hug the Wissahickon Creek. And our preserves that are not directly on the creek have streams or tributaries that enter it. And that's because our goal when we were founded, and continues to be our goal, is to protect land surrounding waterways to help protect water quality. So the more natural land we keep from being developed around creeks and streams, the more natural land stormwater has to flow over. And that means that all the pollutants it collects as it flows over roadways and driveways and parking lots will be more filtered out. So when it does reach the creek, it'll be cleaner. And obviously all of that natural land is going to slow down any stormwater moving and absorb it, which reduces flooding. And we all know that is a big issue in our area. So I can't even fathom what it would be like if these preserves had been developed. But anyway, the map on the right shows Crossways highlighted there, which I did with some fancy technology. And this is just to give you a sense of where it is located in Bluebell. So it's right off of Margaret Rohde, and it sits kind of catty corner to Montgomery County Community College. And it's right near Route 202. So welcome to Crossways. This is the scene that you will see before you if you arrive on a June morning, even though we're in October. And this is probably one of my favorite preserves, which maybe I shouldn't have favorites. And it would be really hard for me to choose, but this is really up there for me. And we've had this preserve since 1997. It was donated to us by the people who owned the property because they were very conservation minded and they wanted to see the land protected forever. So they entrusted it to us to make sure that it would never be developed and that it would stay in its beautiful natural state. It's a total of 57 acres, and it has a really great diversity of habitats. And actually, when we had a botanical inventory done a few years ago, this preserve had the highest percentage of native plants at 70% than any of our other preserves, which is really significant considering invasive species are a serious problem for a lot of our other natural areas. And because of that really high percentage of native plants and the diversity of habitats that we have here, it's the first preserve that we wrote a 10-year conservation management plan for. It's kind of our golden child of preserves. And so the management plans basically set out our goals over a 10-year period for managing the preserve as best we can to support the species that are there or that should be there. So we put a lot of work into collecting baseline information to see what kind of insects we have, what kind of birds and mammals, reptiles, amphibians, so that we could get an understanding of what species are present that might be in need of conservation. And then we base our goals around that. So we divided these habitats up into what we call management units, which you see here on the left. And each of these units has species that are associated with it that we're focusing on. We call these our conservation targets, and they're species that have been seeing population declines, and most of them are listed in the State Wildlife Action Plan as species of greatest conservation need. And the things that get that designation in the action plan are species that are facing really serious threats to their populations and they've been in decline, or they're likely to become listed as threatened or endangered if we don't do anything to support their populations. And Crossways has meadows, it has hardwood forests, stands of evergreens, and emergent wetlands. So there's a lot of different species that exist in those different areas, and we're focusing on managing for, I think, about 34 that fall under that species of greatest conservation need designation. And the needs of those species are kind of what guide our actions on the landscape. So usually when I have a group of people out at Crossways in person in the day, or I'm just going birding by myself, I start out by heading down the Meadow Trail. So that's where we're going to begin our virtual trip. And this is our restored meadow. And this is an area that's about 6 acres. It was in the past completely overrun with invasive species. A lot of multiflora rose and Bradford pear and things like that. It used to be a farm field. And as happens a lot with old farm fields, they kind of become overrun with invasive species once they're not being farmed anymore. So back in I think 2013, and this was before I started working for Wissahickon Trails, we cleared all of that out and made sure those invasive plants were totally eradicated, and then went back in and restored warm season grasses. And the reason we do that is, of course, because invasive species like multiflora rose are a lot less beneficial to wildlife. So they don't produce the same nutritionally rich food as our native species do. And a really important thing to note about that is that our native insects evolved with those native plants. So they recognize them, they rely on them, their lives are tied to them. They don't recognize invasive plants that way because they didn't evolve with them. So they're not very useful to our native insects. So we got rid of those things. We planted a native meadow and we let the grasses establish for a few years. And then we went in and seeded with wildflowers. So these are just a few of the things that you'll see out there growing in the main growing season, which is like June, July. That top left is a major grass, and that's called big blue stem, also known as turkey foot because it looks like a turkey foot. And this is a plant that provides cover for 24 species of songbirds and also produces a lot of nesting space for them. And it has really good pollen for pollinators. So when you're out at Crossways in July, all that really tall grass is this, it's big blue stem. And then in that second picture that is meadow mint, the white flowers. And they are a really common sight at Crossways in the summer. And they are really loved by pollinators. And these are a couple of great black-backed wasps, which are also really common at Crossways. This plant is really cool. It's one of my favorite things out there because during the growing season, it's called meadow mint, and that's because it smells like mint. So it's really a beautiful scent out there in the summer. And then we have a lot of scarlet bee balm, a lot of cardinal flower, a ton of milkweed because we want to have monarchs out there and have them have nectar sources and places to lay their eggs. And then we have a lot of brown-eyed Susans, butterfly weed, and blue vervain. So these are all really great pollinator plants that weren't there a few years ago, and that we seeded them in after we established a healthy meadow with native grasses. As you continue into the meadow, you're going to see this weird structure out in the field, and this is our chimney swift tower. which came about because of a really great partnership we had with Wyncote Audubon Society, which is our local Audubon chapter. And this was initiated back in 2016. So Wissahickon Trails decided that we were going to focus on doing as much as we could to conserve chimney swifts. These are a species of bird that has been declining really rapidly, more so than a lot of other species. And so we really wanted to work on helping their populations wherever we could. And for anyone not too familiar with chimney swifts, I'll tell you a little bit more about them because I love them. They are aerial insectivores, which means they spend the majority of their life on the wing. They actually can't land or perch like other birds, and instead they cling vertically. So they have adaptations for this in the form of elongated claws and really stiff tail feathers that give them extra support. And since they can't perch, they need pretty textured surfaces to cling to, and they find that most easily inside chimneys, which their populations evolved to use over time, because actually historically, they used deadwood for roosting and nesting. And then with European settlement and industrialization, they lost a lot of that habitat. But they're nothing if not adaptable, and they really quickly started using chimneys for nesting and roosting. If you fast forward a few decades, though, we've changed the way that we design chimneys, which makes them unusable to swifts. And we've started removing them or just not building them at all on new constructions. Or we cap them because we don't want birds and other wildlife coming in and using them. So these birds have faced a lot of challenges in terms of habitat loss over the years. And like other birds, climate change is a pretty big threat for them. The more we have hurricanes and tornadoes and crazy storms, the more likely it is for them to have a really difficult time migrating. And they're also losing habitat on their wintering grounds. But by far, the greatest factor for them in their decline is probably pesticides. And one study found that this was a study that was completed in Canada in 2012. Swift populations declined right around the time when DDT was introduced and used. And the reason for that, obviously, is because it caused changes in the availability of insects. And not only that, but also the kind of insects that were available, which was really important because some are more nutritious than others. So all of that is to say that chimney swifts need us to care about them and do as much as we can to provide habitat for them and to provide places where there are plenty of insects. And so we do a lot to study the birds of Crossways. And if you know me at all, you know that birds are kind of my jam. So I'm going to talk about this a lot anytime I'm out there. So we do a lot to study them. And the reason that we are focused on birds at Crossways particularly is that birds serve as a really important indicator about the state of the environment. That's because they're high on the food chain, so they respond really quickly to anything that's happening lower down, any changes lower down in the food chain. So we're really focused on studying them to understand the level of impact that our land management is having. The more we work to remove invasives and plant natives and all the work that I mentioned in that meadow, the more we're hoping to see positive impacts on birds, which we'll only know if we study them. And I always like to note too, though, that there's a lot of factors that are out of our control that determine whether birds are doing well or not, like climate change. So we have to keep that in mind, but we are doing all that we can for them. And the main way that we study birds at Crossways is by participating in the Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship Project, which involves capturing and banding wild birds. And this project was established in 1989 by the Institute for Bird Populations, which is a nonprofit based out in California. And they're dedicated to research on the abundance, distribution, and ecology of birds. The reason that this whole project came about was because for decades, annual surveys like the Christmas bird count and breeding bird surveys, etc., were showing significant declines in a lot of species. So we all knew that birds were dying in dangerous numbers, but we didn't know exactly why. The MAPS project came about as a way to figure out exactly what the main drivers of population declines are and where they're happening in a bird's life cycle. So basically where birds are most vulnerable. We're studying the birds during the breeding season. And the reason for that is because we can look at a couple of different really key demographic parameters that determine whether populations are growing or declining. And the first of those is productivity, which is the amount of young and the rate at which they are being produced. And that's something that we can estimate by comparing the number of birds born during the current season to the number of adults. And the second thing that we're looking at is survival. So most songbirds breed in the same area year after year. That means that the proportion of banded birds that are recaptured the following year is a really good gauge of survival. And from productivity and survival, we can get an idea of recruitment, which is the third and final critical factor in determining whether populations are growing or decreasing. And recruitment is essentially the rate at which breeding individuals are added to the population, either by surviving to breeding age, or if other birds are emigrating in from another population. And recruitment is vital because in a given population, you might have really productive birds. You might have a lot of chicks hatching out, a lot of nesting success. But if too few of those birds survive to make their own chicks, or if too few birds are moving in from elsewhere, that's going to mean low recruitment, and that's going to result in population declines. So with all of our land management, we're really trying to ensure that the birds have what they need so that they have enough to be productive, they have enough areas for nesting and cover, and enough healthy forage around so that they can fuel up before they migrate away. And that means that they can then survive their long journeys. So to study the birds, we put up mist nets, and these are these really fine black mesh nets. And we have 8 of them that we distribute as much as we could in the different habitats of Crossways so that we could catch a variety of species, since birds are really tied to particular habitats and they'll tend to hang out in just one or two. So once the nets are up and open, they're basically invisible. So as birds are flying around doing their thing, they hit the net and drop down into one of its pockets. And we check the nets really frequently so that no birds are in there for too long. And then we take them back to a little central banding area, which is in this picture here. And that's where we process them. And we only do this 8 days out of the year, since it's looking at breeding birds. So it's from May to August, and it breaks out into about 8 days. And every bird gets a band issued by the US Geological Survey. And they're all etched with a unique 9-digit number, and they're made of a really super lightweight aluminum. And they come closed, so we have special tools to open them, like this here. And then we have specially machined pliers that have holes that are exactly the right size for the band for a given bird's leg size. And then for every bird that we collect, we take a lot of information down. The first thing we do after we put that band on is age them. And that's really important for determining productivity, as I mentioned. So for comparing the amount of young born in the current season to the amount of adults that you catch. And it's also really important for survival. And to age birds, we look at differences in their feathers. So we look at single feathers in a tract. So for example, these are all one tract of feathers. These are called the greater coverts. These are the primary coverts. So we look for differences between these feathers in terms of things like sheen and wear and color. And if there are differences, that suggests that the feathers are different ages. And that helps us determine when a bird might have been born. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it varies based on the species. So I won't get into it, but just know that you can age birds by looking at their feathers, which is really cool. And then we also look at their body fat, and this is just a really useful clue about food abundance and general condition. And their skin is translucent. So when you blow the feathers apart, you'll be able to see underneath their skin. And if they have any stored fat deposits, it's going to look yellow, whereas their muscle is going to appear kind of purpley. So in this picture, it's kind of hard to see, but we're looking right here when we blow the feathers apart. And that's an area where they will generally store fat. And you can see it a little bit here, there's some yellow. And then down on their abdomen, it's the same thing. Everything else that's purple is just muscle. And then we take a wing measurement on every bird before we release it, and then we weigh it, and that's it. And if you've seen any of my presentations about birds or banding, you've seen this slide. And you know, I always like to include it because I get asked pretty often whether or not birds bite. And this is a really easy way for me to answer that. So some of them do. Not terrible. Cardinals are pretty bad. They like to really latch onto you, and that can be pretty painful. But most of them is just a little nibble. And I always like to put this in here too. So one of the coolest things about banding is that you get a chance to see really cool features on birds that you might otherwise miss just by seeing them through binoculars. Basically, you can see the full beauty of their plumage when you have them in the hand, and little details like how northern flickers, that's this first bird on the left, they actually have heart-shaped central spots on their feathers, which you can see right here. And then great crested flycatchers have this really gorgeous lemony yellow coloration on their chests, which isn't something that you can see very clearly in the field with binoculars. And then I had to put this in. So when you're a beginning birder and you're learning birds and somebody says, oh, that's a red-bellied woodpecker, and you look at it, it's not going to have a red belly because that's going to be up against the tree. So that's something that you can't really see too well unless you're holding that bird. And since this project started, we've caught 676 individuals across 41 species, which is pretty good for banding in the summer. And I should mention that if you look at eBird, there's been like 101 species documented there, which is pretty awesome. It's a really great place for migrants and breeding birds. Crossways is probably maybe my main go-to for birding. And these are some of the coolest birds that we've caught. So this is a Swainson thrush, a Canada warbler, a mourning warbler, and a Cooper's hawk. And those first three were all caught on the first day of banding in May. So these were late migrants that were coming through. And this was 2018, I think. And we had a lot of rain that year, so migration was a little bit slowed. So these guys were late getting out, and that's why we caught them when we should have been catching breeding birds. But it was really exciting. And this Cooper's hawk was amazing. That's the only hawk that we've ever caught out there. It was very thrilling. And these are the most frequently caught birds and also the most frequently seen birds out there. So gray catbird, song sparrow, American robin, northern cardinal, and common yellowthroat. So these are the birds that you have like 100% chance of seeing if you go out there birding in the summer. And these are some birds that are at Crossways and I see them frequently, but for whatever reason, because they hang out pretty high in the trees or they recognize the nets, we don't catch them a whole lot. So we have an eastern towhee. These were our nemesis bird for years. They would sing all around us and they would not go in the nets. So it took like 6 years to catch one. And then American goldfinches and tree swallows, they're in the meadows a lot. We only have a couple of nets in the meadows, and they also seem to be a little bit net savvy. So some birds can kind of see the net a little bit better than others, and they can get out of it a little easier. And then we have orchard orioles, a male and a female. These usually are breeders every summer, but again, they kind of stay up high, so we don't catch them a lot. And that's also true for red-eyed vireos. And ruby-throated hummingbirds, we've caught a couple of them, but we can't actually band them because that takes a special permit since their bands are so tiny. So if we catch them, we just take measurements, we age them, but we don't put a band on them. Cedar waxwings are pretty common out there, and we do catch them occasionally. We've caught more in the last few years than we did in the first 2 or 3 years, which is always really exciting. And this is a willow flycatcher, and they're a bird that I'll talk about a little bit later, a little bit more, that are a species of greatest conservation need, and they're one that we're focusing management on pretty heavily. All right, so then if you were to continue down the trail on your way into the meadow, you will see that we have some nest boxes. And we've had these out since 2015 or so. At this point, I think we have 4 or 5 out there. And I put this in here because this is one of my favorite pictures that I ever got out there. And these two nestlings, I was out there to do something unrelated to the nest boxes, and they heard me and they started begging. And I was like, I'm not your mom. So the main species that we have in our nest boxes are tree swallows like these. And they make really beautiful nests if you've never seen them. They're lined with feathers. And this is a photo of a nestling that I banded when it was about 12 days old. But mainly what we were trying to attract are eastern bluebirds. And we typically do have at least one pair of these using the nest boxes. And these photos of juveniles I added in here because they're a really good example of how some birds, especially in the thrush family, have a spotted plumage when they're first born. So their first set of feathers has this kind of spotty plumage to it. And the reason they have this coloration is because when they fledge and leave the nest, they'll usually head toward the forest where they'll stay hidden. And that's where their parents will go to feed them. So having this kind of spotting mimics the dappled sunlight in the woods, and it makes them harder for predators to find. And we were interested in learning a little bit more about the bluebirds that we had at Crossways. So for a few years, I banded them with plastic color bands in addition to the aluminum band. And color bands make it possible to just look through your binoculars at a bird, read the colors, and know exactly who it is and when it was banded. And also things like who its mate is and whether it was a nestling last year or it's a returning adult, etc. So we can collect a lot of information by putting color bands on. And one of the things that we wondered was whether or not the bluebirds we were seeing at the preserve in the winter were the same as the ones that were breeding there. And we also wondered if family groups were staying together after the breeding season. Because both of those things, there wasn't a lot of literature out there about them behaviorally. And we learned that they are the same birds. So the birds that nest there stay there through the winter. And they also stay in family groups through the fall. Another cool thing is that if you read about bluebirds, you'll mainly read that they hang out in meadows and fields, right? So like that's their habitat in a field guide. But by spending a lot of time trying to observe them, we found that they spend a lot of time in the forests, which was cool because that's again something that really wasn't documented very much before. And they tend to do that especially in the winter, which is probably related to food availability. But that is a good thing to know because it means we have a better understanding of what their needs are throughout the year. So moving on down the trail, this area is what we call the Shrub-scrub meadow, and it's where we're managing more heavily for willow flycatchers. So this is a bird I mentioned a little while ago. And this area was really overgrown with invasive species. It had a lot of crabapple and Bradford pear. So we cleared those out with volunteers and we replaced them with native trees and shrubs that are tied to this bird. So willow flycatchers like to nest in alders and species of hawthorn. And we put a lot of those out there, along with a lot of other species that are going to produce a lot more berries and nuts that are better for wildlife than what existed before in this site. So that's an example of a bird that is in our management plan for active management. So we want to do as much as we can to provide it what it needs for nesting and for raising its young. And this is at the edge of that meadow where it meets the woods and where we did a little bit more invasive clearing from an area that's like roughly 8 feet by 35 feet. So we cleared that area out and then I built a deer exclosure, little deer fence with a few volunteers to keep deer out of it and to protect, I think 70 trees and shrubs that we added in there. And again, the goal here was just to increase the diversity and abundance of native plants because that's good for insects. And what's good for insects is good for birds, is good for reptiles and amphibians, etc. And then all of these native species are going to produce a lot more fruit and berries than what was there before, which was multiflora rose mostly. So this is right on the edge of the woods, which is Harris Woods. And this is kind of the heart of Crossways. It's 22 acres, and we call it Harris Woods after the family that donated the preserve to us, the Harris family. And this area actually is listed on the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Database as a site of importance for its ecological significance. So we know from aerial photographs from 1942 that this spot was maintained as a woodlot, where most of the surroundings at Crossways and a lot of other areas in Montgomery County were cleared for farmland. So it has some older trees in it that are pretty significant. And in the spring, it has a really nice layer of spring ephemerals, like these May apples right here. It's a really important habitat for a lot of forest birds that we have. And scarlet tanagers are one of them. That's this bird on the left. We have usually 1 or 2 pairs of nesting redtails. Yellow-billed cuckoos are frequent in the spring when they're migrating through. And then this is a picture of a wood thrush nest that I found by chance once when I was out there. And both wood thrushes and scarlet tanagers are what are known as Pennsylvania responsibility species. And that is because a large percentage of their global breeding population breeds in Pennsylvania, which means that as a state, we have a greater responsibility to take care of them and manage for them. So those 2 birds are in our management plan, and they're birds that we're thinking about a lot when we decide what we're going to do to restore the preserve. And then this down here is a hermit thrush. They migrate more commonly in the fall, and sometimes they do stay and hang out through the winter. And there's a ton of white-breasted nuthatches out there. They're really great forest species. And we have great horned owls, which we only know about because we see them every time we go out to see woodcocks. We don't see the woodcocks, but we see great horned owls. And Harris Woods has a lot of these really cool pocket habitats, like this little freshwater wetland. And this is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designated wetland. And it has a lot of skunk cabbage and really good native wetland plants that are important for a lot of species. And this is important water resources for a lot of things. So frogs and turtles and snakes that need these little patches of wetland. But we wanted to increase the amount of water resources on the preserve. That was a goal in our management plan. So we created this small little pool inside Harris Woods. And it was a really cool project because we worked with the adjacent landowner. So she has a horse farm. She had several horses that she was nervous about walking back there in the winter because she had water pooling on her property, and that made it really nerve-wracking for riding by because it's pretty easy for horses to slip on the ice. So she reached out to us about this issue, and we came up with an idea. So we diverted the water off of her property via an underground pipe, and now it feeds this pond. So her problem was solved, and we created some more wildlife habitat. And sometimes it's hard to predict how this kind of project is going to go. And we had planned for it to be a vernal pool, but it kind of just has become a woodland pond, which is fine. That just means it holds water throughout the year instead of just in the spring or the fall. So this is a really great source for a lot of things. Green frogs love it. There's a million of them there in the summer. And it's important also for birds and other mammals when other water sources have dried out. This remains, and that's really pretty clutch for them. And we have a lot of reptiles and amphibians at Crossways. So these are eastern red-backed salamanders, which you can see also come in a lead-backed phase. And this is an eastern box turtle. And that is another species that we're hoping to support because they're listed as an IUCN vulnerable species, and that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And a listing of vulnerability means that their populations are likely to become extirpated, which means not extinct, but gone locally from where they are. So one of the things that they need is to be near a water source and to have good ground cover. So those are a couple of things that we're really trying to create for them at the preserve. And we also have a variety of snakes. This is a DK's brown snake, which I've seen quite a few of out there. And of course we have garter snakes and water snakes in some of the waterways. And the same way that we monitor birds as a measure of our impact, of our land management, we're similarly monitoring salamanders. And this is a really cool project that our senior naturalists established. And we're basically trying to get a baseline for what species we have present and their relative abundance so that we understand what's happening with their populations over time and we can kind of keep track of trends. So we have cover boards out in the woods, these slices of tree, or sometimes we call them tree cookies. And we have community scientists who go out and flip the boards. And if they find salamanders underneath them, they'll carefully pick them up and ID them and take a few measurements, like their weight and their length. And they'll record information about the site, like the soil temperature underneath that board and the soil moisture level. So there's 5 transects of these 10 boards out there, so 50 boards. And we have volunteers monitoring them in the spring and the fall. And then they give us that data at the end of the season. So I mentioned deer exclosures a couple of times, and this is our largest one. So if you were to continue to walk down the Meadow Trail, you would come to this. And it fences off 2.5 acres. And we chose this area because inside the exclosure, there's a small emergent wetland, which had a lot of good species to begin with for certain wetland butterflies that are also in decline. So it has things like cattails and New York ironweed and asters and white turtlehead growing in there. And we also planted a bunch of those things and some plants that are specifically tied to butterflies that are in decline. So we planted host and nectar plants for those species, the things that they need to survive. And we periodically go in and remove invasive species that come up, like purple loosestrife, which is kind of a problem in there. And this was an AmeriCorps group that came out to help me on a beautiful 90-degree August day. So if you're into birds and just nature in general, you're probably going to be into butterflies. And these are some of the most common ones that we have at Crossways. So we have a red-banded hairstreak, a silvery spotted skipper. Eastern tiger swallowtails are really abundant in most of the meadow areas. And little wood satyrs are all over the woods in June and July. And they have a really beautiful kind of soft, fluttery flight that I just love. There's a lot of sulfurs out there, like this orange sulfur, red admirals, common buckeyes. The most common form of skipper is this one. It's a Zabulon skipper. And then there's also a lot of pearl crescents and the black form of the eastern tiger swallowtail. And of course, we have monarchs, which we're trying to support by adding milkweed into our meadows. And our senior naturalists established a monitoring project for these as well, for their population. So she collects eggs in the wild and she raises the caterpillars and then she tags the monarchs. And she also catches them in the field, like monarchs that have bred out naturally and hatched out. She'll catch them and tag them as well. So all of this is part of Monarch Watch, which started about 30 years ago. And the purpose is to associate the location of original capture of butterflies with the point of recovery in Mexico. And that is supposed to tell us more about monarch migration. So some of the things that we wonder are like, do the monarchs that breed at and migrate through Crossways make it to Mexico? And what is the timing of that like, and the pace of migration? And what is mortality like? So by tagging the butterflies that hatch out on the preserve and the ones that are caught as they're migrating through, we're trying to connect our area to different areas of the world and learn more about monarch migration, which is really very cool. So that would kind of wrap up your walk through the meadow. And if I was out there with a group at this point, I would probably turn around and head up to the parking lot, or you can then continue down the crushed stone path, which is called the Crossways Trail. And this is a county trail that was built 4 or 5 years ago, and it kind of hugs the edge of the preserve. So as you're walking down, you'll start out by walking through a really nice corridor of silky dogwoods and viburnums. And I threw in a picture of yellow warblers here because they love that habitat and I always see them out there. And it's funny because for years we wanted to catch them at the banding station, but we never did until this year. So we've only caught one in the 7 years that we've been banding. But anyway, and then if you continue down that trail, you'll come to this wetland area, which is another really important habitat for a lot of wildlife. And so we have a bat box out here. Oops. And this is one of 2 bat boxes that we have on the preserve. We know that there's long-eared bats and Indiana bats. Long-eared bats are threatened and Indiana bats are endangered. And we know that they are in Pennsylvania. We don't know though if they are around necessarily at Crossways, but we would like to make sure that they have habitat if they are. And also this is habitat for little brown bats and other of our more common species. We actually want to do some bat surveys in the next couple of years so that we have a better idea of what might be around so that we can make better decisions about how we manage for them. That'll be fun to know. Then if you continue down the trail, you'll come to this really cool boardwalk, which actually won an award from the county after it was installed for sustainability, because it's made from recycled materials. And so is the crushed stone path that leads to it. Then you can actually see little chunks of tennis court in that path. So it's a really cool example of how you can build new trails in a sustainable way and with recycled materials. So then if you were to go around the corner of this boardwalk, you'd kind of hit the end of the preserve and the Crossways Trail continues. You can connect to the Green Ribbon Trail. But since we're just visiting Crossways, that's pretty much where we would end our walk in person. So that's where I'm going to end it tonight. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But thank you all for visiting Crossways with me. And I hope that if you haven't gotten a chance to get out there, you will very soon. It's a really beautiful time of year to get out there too.
Thanks, Margaret. I have a question. Have you seen any of the chimney swifts at the tower at Crossways?
No, and it kills me. So I have read many times, and I've heard from other people that have built towers that it can take years for them to find them and use them. So I still have hope that maybe they will, but no, they haven't. I haven't been out there though at dusk during migration, so I don't know if they're using it for roosting, but I know that they haven't used it yet for nesting. Fingers crossed.
Is there anybody else doing banding in this immediate area that you know?
The closest banding station is in Newtown Square. And that's the Willistown Conservation Trust has a little site where they do maps banding. So they do the same banding that we do, but they also do spring and fall migration. And I think there's a couple of places in New Jersey across the border.
Mm-hmm. I was just curious if you ever saw any banded birds that you didn't do the banding at Crossways.
No, we haven't. It would be cool. And I think if we banded more in the spring and the fall, we would probably see that a lot. But we're just catching the same birds that breed there year after year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, if nobody has any other questions, I'll let you all go.
Okay. Thanks, Margaret.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks you. Thank you.
All right. Good night.
Night.
Good night.